My name is Lachlan McIntosh, and I did my Issues in Special Education project on the benefits and issues of the inclusive classroom. So my project it focuses on the benefits and deficits or issues of the inclusive classroom, and the purpose of my topic is to explore the idea of the inclusive classroom and gauge how effective it really is. Because many of our classes are back this inclusive classroom model very strongly. The KUCA college instructors seem to be very behind the idea, so I wanted to examine the issue from different angles to see what strengths and weaknesses it offered beyond what we have already learned. And the general idea of the inclusive classroom is that all students, regardless of their disability, are placed in general education classrooms for instruction. Some benefits of the inclusive classroom: they build social skills of differently abled individuals by having them interact with peers throughout the day. This is actually a huge benefit to them, as differently abled individuals wouldn't really get this level of peer interaction anywhere else, because a lot of places still do have different set-aside rooms for differently abled individuals, especially the more severely disabled, where they are just kind of separated from everybody else their age. Some stats have shown that differently abled students perform better in inclusive classrooms, and general education students' performance is usually unaffected, meaning that people that are afraid of outbursts and whatnot from a differently abled individual in a general education classroom, those situations for the most part do not happen in schools that do practice inclusion. The scores of a general education student relatively stays the same. It also promotes acceptance among the people in the classroom, because you're learning to accept someone with a disability. You're learning alongside them. Some issues of the inclusive classroom: differently able students may not get the help they need, as you're in a full classroom setting. They are not by themselves with more teachers and aides in other rooms as they would be, depending on if you're using another method to teach. General education teachers usually feel unequipped for dealing with fully inclusive classrooms. If a general education teacher cannot deal with the differently abled students, then it can slow down the learning of the whole class. And as I said with the last slide, a lot of schools that do have inclusive classrooms don't usually have this problem, but they're also usually the places that use this inclusion method are more supportive of getting their educators trained to deal with students that are differently abled, so special education. Statistics regarding inclusive classrooms are often skewed, as students with less prominent learning disabilities are often pushed to the forefront. So this means that students with smaller learning disabilities like ADHD are probably going to get higher test scores than a student with a more severe learning disability. And a lot of times statistics will kind of push, you're going to have bias, and they will push for the statistics to show in their favor. So they would show the test scores of the ADHD student, who might already be in a general education classroom regardless, because their disability is less severe than others. The inclusive classroom learning environment was actually not created by special education experts. It came about as a law by the government to have students educated in the least restrictive learning environment. So some research on administrators, their look on it. In my research, I found that most administrators seem to be very on board with the inclusive classroom learning environment. They all tend to firmly support it, which actually, when I interviewed an administrator, they had a very similar view on what I found in the literature. And she actually stated she'd be on board with inclusive classrooms, but she actually liked her current setup of the building at the moment, meaning that she is not, the building she's in is not currently practicing an inclusive classroom model, but if they were, she would be behind it. So, what I found in the literature on parents of differently abled children. For the most part, it actually surprised me that they have a more negative look on the inclusive classroom. They're actually afraid that their child may not be getting the support they need because if they're placed in a general education classroom, they feel like less supports are going to be available to their child. In the interview, this actually stayed somewhat consistent. She stated that she believed the classroom her child is in is currently the best learning environment he could be in, which is fair enough. If your child is learning to the best, you're not going to want to change that. But I thought it was interesting that her view completely coincided with the view of the other parents of differently abled children. General education parents are actually the more supportive of the two parent groups. Their main issue with the inclusive classrooms is if differently abled students are negatively impacting class instruction. But if this issue is not a problem, then most parents have no issues with the implementation of inclusive classrooms. So this means I felt like it was important to put that in, but most general education parents, that is their main concern, but for the most part, this concern is usually addressed, and in places that practice inclusion, it's not a problem. The educator's view. Actually, most educators that I found when researching literature had a negative view toward the inclusive classroom because they felt they were under-equipped to teach an inclusive classroom with the training that they had had. So many special educators also agreed that the amount of time spent in the inclusive classroom should be dependent on how much the child can spend there. They should spend a lot of time there if they can, but if their disability is more severe, then they should be pulled out for more time in order to ensure that they are learning to the best of their ability. The special education teacher actually, again, kind of responded the way that I saw in the research, the one that I interviewed, that is. They believe that differently abled students should spend as much time as they can in general education classrooms, but fully integrating them into general education classrooms at this time, it's just important to make sure that they're getting the help supplied to them. And it might not be as possible in a general education classroom as it is in a special education classroom. And then this was another point I had, bullying in the inclusive classroom. So what I found, I actually found some literature that had documented cases of bullying happening in an inclusive classroom, and the students with the disabilities were the ones being bullied more than the students without the disabilities. I asked the participants in my interview about bullying, and they were all very strong that they had not seen anything of the case. And the parent of the differently abled child stated that when their child is in the general education classroom, all the students are actually very supportive of the child and help him with whatever he needs. So kind of very, very different things I found there under bullying. So my conclusions. In order for inclusive classrooms to work, administrators, educators, and parents all need to be properly informed and committed to the inclusive classroom structure. This means everybody needs to be on the same page, and they all have to back the inclusive classroom. Teachers need more training and be able to manage inclusive classrooms effectively. Obviously, in our school, this isn't as big of an issue as a lot of us go here for dual certification in special education, so it wouldn't be as big. And that's also a program that's actually a lot of schools in New York offer, is the dual certification for special education. So it's actually becoming less of a problem now. Parents need to know that their children will still be able to perform at the best of their ability. And though cases of bullying exist, I don't think they're prominent enough to pin exclusively on inclusive classrooms. This may be due to the location of the schools that are experiencing the bullying, and they may be just experiencing bullying that may be a long-standing problem for their school. I wouldn't pin it on inclusive classrooms because I have not found enough data to back up that inclusive classrooms are a definite cause of bullying to the differently abled individuals that learn in inclusive classrooms. And it is important to keep in mind inclusive classrooms themselves need to be looked at by special educators more closely, because while the idea of a classroom where everybody is included and can learn at the best of their ability is enticing, we actually have to realize that these classrooms might not be the answer to equal although we want these classrooms to be the answer to equal learning and acceptance, we have to keep in mind that these classrooms were actually first put in place due to new laws regarding special education by politicians and not special education experts. So, inclusive classrooms are a great idea, but I believe that they need to be looked at more by experts in order to ensure everybody's learning to the fullest potential in these environments. So overall, I would say that inclusive classrooms are definitely a positive learning environment it seems a lot of schools are trying to go in this direction now, but at the same time, I do think they need to be looked at by special educators more in order to ensure both general education students and differently abled students are learning to their full potential. That's all.